The cold steel of a suppressed beretta pressed sharply against the back of her thick neck. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the fatal gunshot. She was just the housekeeper, a heavy-set woman who had made a single, catastrophic mistake, latching the legendary sapphire necklace of a dead mafia queen around her own throat. But the gunshot never came. Instead, the most ruthless crime boss in Chicago dropped his weapon, sank to the hardwood floor, and let out a guttural sob of pure agony. What happened next would unravel the underworld forever. Clara Jenkins was a woman accustomed to taking up space physically, yet remaining entirely invisible. At 260 pounds, her broad shoulders and heavy hips felt less like a burden and more like a carefully constructed shield, especially in her line of work. She was the head housekeeper for the Falcone estate, a sprawling, fortified mansion tucked away behind wrought-iron gates in the affluent Chicago suburb of Lake Forest. It was a home built on blood money, imported Italian marble, and silence. For 3 years, Clara had navigated the echoing halls of the estate with the quiet precision of a ghost. She wore a slate-gray uniform that did nothing to flatter her soft, thick waistline, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, utilitarian bun. The men who guarded the doors, men with broken noses, tailored suits, and bulges under their arms, never looked twice at her. To them, the fat housekeeper was a fixture, a piece of furniture that smelled faintly of lemon pledge and lavender soap. She was safe because she was undesirable to their dangerous world, a stark contrast to the lithe, surgically enhanced women who occasionally graced the arms of the lower-ranking soldiers. But the master of the house, Lorenzo Falcone, brought no women home. Lorenzo was a man carved from granite and grief. As the undisputed head of the Chicago syndicate, he ruled the city's port operations and underground casinos with a merciless, calculating hand. Yet, inside the walls of his mansion, he was a hollowed-out shell. 3 years prior, a rival faction from the Lucchese family had planted a remote detonated explosive beneath his armored Cadillac. Lorenzo had lingered in a cigar bar on Rush Street for 5 extra minutes. His wife, Isabella, had not. Isabella Falcone had been a vision of high society perfection, slender, graceful, with a laugh that could disarm a room full of hardened killers. Her sudden, violent death had shattered Lorenzo, turning a pragmatic businessman into a notoriously brutal tyrant. He had spent the first year after her death painting the streets of Chicago red, eradicating the Lucchese loyalists one by one. Now, he lived in a self-imposed, stony silence. Clara's duties rarely brought her face to face with Lorenzo. He left before dawn and returned long after the sun had set over Lake Michigan. Her primary responsibility, the one that paid her an exorbitant, hush-money salary of 6 figures a year, was the upkeep of the East Wing, specifically the master suite. The suite was a mausoleum. Lorenzo slept on a leather sofa in his adjacent study, refusing to desecrate the custom king-sized bed where Isabella's silk pillows still sat perfectly arranged. Clara was tasked with keeping the room exactly as it had been on the morning of June 12th, 3 years ago. The air was perpetually stale, artificially chilled to preserve the delicate fabrics, and heavy with the lingering, haunting scent of Isabella's signature perfume, Chanel No. 5. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in August, Clara pushed her heavy wooden cleaning cart down the long hallway toward the master suite. Outside, dark storm clouds were gathering over the lake, casting long, menacing shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The house was unusually quiet. Lorenzo was supposed to be in Cicero, mediating a high-stakes territorial dispute. The armed guards were patrolling the perimeter, leaving the interior of the mansion to Clara and the ticking grandfather clocks. She unlocked the heavy oak door of the master suite, her breath catching slightly as it always did. The room was immaculate, a testament to her meticulous nature. She moved methodically, her thick rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the imported Persian rugs. She dusted the mahogany dressers, polished the silver picture frames, holding images of a smiling Isabella, and fluffed the untouched velvet duvet. Her final task was the vanity. It was a beautiful antique French piece situated beneath a massive gilded mirror. On top of it sat an ornate, velvet-lined jewelry box. Clara had been given strict orders by Lorenzo's underboss, a terrifyingly quiet man named Matteo. Clean the vanity. Never open the box. Never touch what is inside. Clara had obeyed that rule for 3 years. She respected the boundaries of her employment, understanding that curiosity in the Falcone household was often a terminal condition. But today, the heavy, oppressive humidity seemed to seep through the walls, making her clumsy. As she reached across the vanity to polish the far corner of the mirror, her heavy forearm brushed against the side of the jewelry box. It was a slight bump, barely enough to shift the heavy wooden chest. But the intricate brass latch, perhaps worn down by time, or perhaps never fully secured, clicked open. The heavy lid fell backward with a soft thud. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her plump cheeks. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for alarms to blare or a guard to burst through the door. But the mansion remained dead silent, save for the low rumble of thunder outside. Slowly, she lowered her hands and peered into the box. It was empty, save for a single item resting on a bed of white satin. It was a necklace. But calling it a simple necklace was a severe understatement. It was a blindingly beautiful, terrifyingly heavy piece of jewelry. A massive teardrop-shaped blue sapphire sat at the center, encircled by a halo of flawless, brilliant-cut diamonds. The chain itself was thick platinum, intricately woven. Clara recognized it immediately from the whispers in the kitchen and the old society newspaper clippings she had secretly read. It was the Tears of Sicily, a priceless family heirloom that Lorenzo had gifted Isabella on their wedding day. It was rumored to be cursed, carrying the blood of a dozen mafia wives before her. And it was the very necklace Isabella was supposed to be wearing the night she died, left behind on this vanity, because the clasp had been broken. Clara stood there, her chest heaving, staring at the glittering stones. She knew she should close the lid. She knew she should walk away. But the sapphire seemed to catch the dim light of the oncoming storm, glowing with a hypnotic, icy fire. The storm broke over Lake Forest with a violent crack of thunder that rattled the reinforced glass of the master suite. Inside the silent, air-conditioned room, Clara Jenkins remained paralyzed before the vanity, staring down at the Tears of Sicily. She was a sensible woman. At 42, carrying an extra 100 pounds of weight, Clara's life had been entirely devoid of glamour. Her world consisted of scrubbing baseboards, managing grocery deliveries for hardened criminals, and going home to a quiet, lonely apartment in Logan Square. She had never worn a piece of jewelry that cost more than $50. The sheer weight of the wealth resting on that satin cushion was incomprehensible to her. Without entirely realizing she was doing it, Clara reached out. Her thick, calloused fingers, stripped of their usual yellow rubber cleaning gloves, trembled as they hovered over the platinum chain. The metal was surprisingly cold. She lifted it, the massive sapphire catching the flashes of lightning from the window. It felt incredibly heavy, a physical manifestation of Lorenzo Falcone's dangerous empire. Just for a second, she thought, a foolish, reckless voice echoing in her mind, just to see what it feels like to hold something so beautiful. She turned toward the gilded mirror. Her reflection stared back at her. A round, flushed face, a double chin, a plain grey uniform stretched tight across her ample bosom. She looked entirely out of place in the opulent room, a peasant trespassing in a dead queen's castle. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable wave of grief for her own mundane life, Clara brought the necklace up to her throat. The cold sapphire settled into the hollow of her collarbone, a stark, glittering contrast against her pale, unadorned skin. She reached behind her thick neck, fumbling with the heavy platinum clasp. It slipped, then caught, clicking into place. Clara let her arms drop to her sides. She stared at herself in the mirror, mesmerized. For a fleeting second, the heavy grey uniform faded away, and she saw the undeniable beauty of the stone illuminating her features. It didn't make her slender, it didn't make her Isabella, but it made her feel visible. Downstairs, the heavy oak front doors burst open. Clara didn't hear it over the booming thunder. She didn't hear the angry, rapid footsteps of Lorenzo Falcone storming across the marble foyer, his expensive tailored suit dripping with rain and blood that wasn't his own. The meeting in Cicero had been a trap. 2 of his men were dead, and Lorenzo was operating on pure, unadulterated adrenaline and rage. He had come back to the estate to retrieve a secondary ledger hidden in his study and to arm himself for a war. Upstairs, Clara finally snapped out of her trance. The reality of what she had done crashed down on her with suffocating force. Panic flared in her chest. "Take it off! Take it off now!" she ordered herself. She reached behind her neck, her thick fingers frantically seeking the platinum clasp. But her hands were sweaty with panic, and the intricate mechanism, the same one that had broken and spared the necklace from the car bomb 3 years ago, refused to budge. The metal teeth had jammed. "Come on," Clara whimpered aloud, pulling at the chain. It dug sharply into the soft flesh of her neck. "Please, God, no." The sound of heavy, rapid footsteps echoing down the hallway froze the blood in her veins. The door to the master suite was violently shoved open. It hit the wall with a deafening crack. Clara gasped, dropping her hands from her neck and spinning around. Lorenzo Falcone stood in the doorway. He was a terrifying sight. Standing 6'3", his broad shoulders filled the frame. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with rain, and his usually immaculate bespoke suit was ruined, torn at the sleeve. But it was his eyes that stopped Clara's heart. They were pitch black, wide, and feral. In his right hand, gripped with white-knuckled intensity, was a suppressed Beretta 9mm. He had drawn the weapon instinctively upon seeing a shadow moving in his dead wife's sanctuary. He took 2 long, predatory strides into the room, raising the gun, the silencer aimed squarely at the center of Clara's forehead. Clara stumbled backward, her heavy frame hitting the vanity. The jewelry box rattled. "Mr. Falcone, please!" she shrieked, tears instantly spilling over her round cheeks. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Lorenzo's finger was tight on the trigger. He saw her, the fat, unremarkable housekeeper in her grey uniform. His brain processed the intrusion, the disrespect, the absolute violation of his sacred space. The rage that had been boiling inside him since Cicero threatened to erupt in a single squeeze of his index finger. But then, the lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in a harsh, brilliant white light. The flash caught the massive blue sapphire resting against Clara's collarbone. Lorenzo froze. Time seemed to stop entirely. His eyes darted from Clara's terrified, tear-streaked face down to her chest. He saw the platinum chain digging into her soft neck. He saw the tears of Sicily. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, her large body trembling violently as she braced for the bullet that would end her life. She waited for the sound, for the darkness. The heavy silence of the room was broken not by a gunshot, but by a sharp, metallic clatter. Clara flinched. She opened one terrified eye. The Beretta lay on the plush Persian rug. Lorenzo Falcone, the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, a man who had ordered the executions of dozens without a second thought, staggered backward. His hands came up to clutch his own chest, his fingers digging into the ruined fabric of his suit. His face, seconds ago a mask of murderous fury, had crumbled completely. His knees buckled. The giant of a man collapsed onto the floor, landing hard against the edge of the untouched velvet bed. Clara stared in absolute shock. Lorenzo wasn't angry. He was weeping. A guttural, agonizing sound tore its way out of his throat. A sob so raw and devastating it sounded like a physical wound. He pulled his knees up, burying his face in his large hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently as years of repressed, suffocating grief violently broke the dam. Clara stood, frozen, the priceless sapphire heavy on her neck, watching the most dangerous man in the city shatter into a million pieces at her feet. The only sounds in the opulent master suite were the violent lashings of rain against the reinforced glass and the ragged, tearing sobs of Lorenzo Falcone. Clara Jenkins stood entirely motionless, the air trapped in her lungs, her wide eyes darting from the discarded, suppressed Beretta on the Persian rug to the hulking mass of the crime boss weeping on the floor. He was a monster. She knew this. The entire city of Chicago knew this. Lorenzo was the man who had allegedly ordered the infamous Valentine's Day massacre at the old meatpacking plant on Halsted Street, a brutal retaliation that had left 6 men hanging from steel hooks. He was the man who owned corrupt judges, who dined with senators at the Drake Hotel, and who ruled the underground with an iron, blood-soaked fist. Yet here he was, reduced to a trembling, broken boy, at the sight of a sapphire resting on the collarbone of his overweight, terrified housekeeper. Clara's thick legs felt like they might give out under her heavy frame. Her instinct, the pure, unadulterated survival instinct that had kept her invisible and alive for 3 years, screamed at her to run. She should kick the heavy oak door open, sprint down the grand marble staircase, and disappear into the storm, leaving the necklace and her life behind. But as she watched Lorenzo clutch his chest, his broad shoulders heaving as if he were physically trying to hold his heart together, something else took over. It was a deep, maternal empathy that Clara had suppressed for years, a quiet ache for a man drowning in a grief she understood all too well. She had lost her own father to a brutal factory accident when she was 19, and she remembered the suffocating weight of sudden, violent loss. Slowly, her thick, rubber-soled shoes taking tentative steps, Clara moved away from the vanity. "Mr. Falcone," she whispered, her voice trembling. It sounded incredibly small in the cavernous, heavily shadowed room. Lorenzo didn't look up. He just shook his head, burying his face deeper into his large, calloused hands. The expensive fabric of his suit was soaked with rainwater and smeared with dark, drying blood from the shootout in Cicero. Clara stopped 2 feet away from him. She slowly lowered her heavy body, her knees popping in the quiet room, until she was kneeling on the rug beside the discarded gun. She didn't reach for the weapon. Instead, she reached up to her own throat, her chubby fingers desperately clawing at the platinum clasp of the Tears of Sicily. "I'll take it off," she stammered, her voice thick with unshed tears of panic. "I swear to God, Mr. Falcone, I didn't mean to disrespect her. I bumped the box. It fell open. I was just so stupid. I'll take it off right now." She pulled and twisted at the metal behind her neck, the heavy platinum chain biting painfully into her soft flesh. She was pulling so hard she was choking herself, a dark red welt forming around her thick neck. "It's stuck!" she cried out, hyperventilating. "Please, I can't get it undone." The sound of her panicked choking finally pierced through Lorenzo's breakdown. He drew in a massive, shuddering breath and slowly lifted his head. His dark eyes were bloodshot, hollowed out, and rimmed with a terrible, agonizing red. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in 3 years. He didn't see the fat housekeeper. He saw a terrified woman strangling herself with his dead wife's jewelry. "Stop," Lorenzo rasped. His voice was a gravelly, broken whisper, stripped of its usual terrifying command. Clara froze, her hands still desperately gripping the chain at her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for him to pick up the gun and finish the job. Instead, Lorenzo slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his movements sluggish and heavy. He knelt directly in front of her. He was so close she could smell the copper tang of blood, the sharp scent of gunpowder, and the expensive musk of his cologne. He reached out with both hands. Clara flinched violently, letting out a sharp whimper, expecting him to wrap his massive hands around her thick neck and snap it. But his hands were astonishingly gentle. His long, strong fingers brushed against the soft, sweaty skin of her neck as he reached around to the back of the clasp. He wasn't looking at her face. His eyes were fixed entirely on the massive blue sapphire resting against her chest. "She didn't forget it," Lorenzo whispered, his voice trembling with a horrific realization. Clara opened her eyes, her breathing shallow and erratic. "What?" "The police," Lorenzo continued, speaking more to himself than to her. He was staring at the stone as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Detective James O'Rourke, the lead investigator on the bombing. He told me the clasp was broken. That's why Isabella left it on the vanity that night. That's why she wasn't wearing it when the car went up." Clara remained perfectly still as Lorenzo's fingers expertly manipulated the platinum mechanism behind her neck. But then he stopped. "It's not broken," Lorenzo said, the profound sadness in his voice suddenly hardening into something sharp, cold, and infinitely more dangerous. "It's not?" Clara whispered, confused. "No," Lorenzo said, his dark eyes snapping up to meet hers. The feral, predatory light had returned to his gaze. But this time, it wasn't directed at Clara. "It's been swapped. This isn't a faulty clasp. It's a locking mechanism. A jeweler's lock, designed so it can't be removed without a specific key. Somebody intentionally locked this around your neck." Clara's heart plummeted into her stomach. "But I put it on myself. I just pushed it closed." "And by doing so, you engaged the deadbolt," Lorenzo explained, his jaw clenching. "Isabella didn't leave it behind because it was broken. She left it behind because she knew she was going to die. She left it for me to find." The heavy, suffocating silence of the master suite was violently shattered by the sound of boots pounding up the grand marble staircase. Voices, sharp and urgent, echoed through the vast, empty halls of the estate. "Boss! Lorenzo, where are you?" It was Matteo. The underboss. The quiet, terrifying shadow who handled Lorenzo's most gruesome problems. Clara's blood ran completely cold. If Matteo walked into this room and saw her wearing the sacred necklace, kneeling next to Lorenzo and a dropped gun, he wouldn't ask questions. He would simply put a bullet between her eyes and roll her heavy body up in one of the Persian rugs. Clara scrambled backward, her thick legs awkwardly pushing her away from Lorenzo. She bumped hard against the wooden vanity, her hands instinctively flying up to cover the blinding sapphire at her throat. "Please," she begged, her voice barely a squeak. "Hide me. Please, I'll leave. I'll never say a word." Lorenzo didn't move to retrieve his weapon. Instead, he slowly stood up, his towering frame casting a massive, intimidating shadow over her. The broken, weeping man from moments ago had vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating mafia don who ruled the Chicago underworld. He quickly smoothed the ruined lapels of his suit, wiping a smear of blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. The door to the suite, already hanging open, was suddenly filled by Matteo. The underboss was holding a customized tactical shotgun, his dark eyes scanning the room with lethal efficiency. Two other heavily armed soldiers stacked up behind him in the hallway. Matteo's eyes immediately fell on the dropped Beretta, then to Lorenzo, and finally to Clara, cowering against the vanity with her hands clamped over her chest. "Boss," Matteo said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He raised the barrel of the shotgun, pointing it directly at Clara's broad chest. "What happened? Is there a problem with the help?" Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a pathetic sob escaping her lips. This was it. She was going to die on the floor of a dead woman's bedroom because she wanted to feel pretty for 30 seconds. "Lower the weapon, Matteo," Lorenzo commanded. His voice was absolute zero. It carried no anger, only an unquestionable authority that immediately sucked the oxygen out of the room. Matteo hesitated for a fraction of a second, confusion flashing across his scarred face, before he lowered the shotgun to his side. "The perimeter is secure. We dealt with the tales from Cicero. But you disappeared, boss. We thought they had a man inside." "There is no man inside," Lorenzo said evenly. He stepped between Matteo and Clara, using his massive body to shield her entirely from the underboss's view. "The situation is under control." Matteo leaned slightly to the side, trying to get a look at the terrified, heavy-set housekeeper trembling against the furniture. "What's she doing in here?" "Nobody comes in here." "She was cleaning," Lorenzo lied smoothly. "I startled her. I dropped my weapon. It went off accidentally in my mind, but not in reality. Tell the men to stand down. Secure the gates. Nobody enters. Nobody leaves. We are going into full lockdown." "Lockdown?" Matteo frowned. "Boss, the Cicero meet was a bloodbath. The Lucchese family made a direct play for your life today. We need to be on the offensive, not hiding in the house." "We are blind, Matteo," Lorenzo suddenly roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings like thunder. The outburst made both Matteo and Clara flinch. The ambush in Cicero wasn't just a hit. It was a distraction. Someone from the inside fed them our route. We have a rat in our inner circle. Matteo's face hardened. "Who? I don't know yet," Lorenzo said, his tone dropping back to a lethal whisper. "But I have a lead, and until I verify it, nobody leaves this estate. Post guards at every door." And Matteo, "Yeah, boss. If anyone so much as looks at Clara wrong, you bring me their head. She is under my personal absolute protection. Is that understood?" Matteo's eyes widened in sheer shock. The fat, invisible housekeeper. Protected by the Don himself? It made absolutely no sense, but in the Falcone family, questioning an order was a death sentence. "Understood, boss." Matteo backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind him with a heavy click. The moment they were alone, Clara slumped down against the vanity, her heavy body hitting the floor with a dull thud. She wrapped her thick arms around her knees, burying her face in her lap as her massive chest heaved with terrified sobs. She was trapped. She was locked inside a mafia fortress with a target on her back. Lorenzo turned around, looking down at her. He bent over and picked up his Beretta, checking the safety before sliding it into his shoulder holster. "Get up, Clara," he said quietly. "I can't," she sobbed, rocking back and forth. "They're going to kill me. They're going to think I'm part of this. Just cut it off me. Take a knife and cut the chain, please." "I can't cut platinum of that thickness without industrial tools," Lorenzo stated factually, offering her a large hand. "And even if I could, I wouldn't. If my theory is correct, that necklace holds the key to who actually murdered my wife." Isabella knew the police were corrupt. She knew O'Rourke was on the Lucchese payroll. She swapped the clasp and left it here because she hid something inside it, something O'Rourke missed. Clara looked up, her tear-streaked, round face pale with terror. She dropped her hands from her chest, revealing the blinding, cursed sapphire. What could possibly be inside a necklace? Lorenzo stepped closer, his dark eyes fixed on the heavy, intricate platinum setting behind the massive blue stone. When Isabella's father was the head of the Sicilian mob, they didn't use digital ledgers or flash drives. They used something much older and much harder to destroy. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing against the cold, hard surface of the sapphire resting against Clara's skin. "A micro-engraving," Lorenzo whispered, "hidden beneath the stone, a list of every corrupt politician, judge, and police officer on the payroll. A list that someone killed her to obtain and failed. And right now, Clara, you are the only person in the world wearing it." The reality of Lorenzo's words hung in the chilling air of the master suite, heavier than the thick, humid storm raging outside the fortified windows. A micro-engraving, a hit list of corrupt officials hidden beneath a priceless sapphire, currently locked around the thick, sweating neck of a housekeeper who bought her groceries at the discount market in Logan Square. Clara Jenkins felt a wave of profound nausea wash over her. She gripped the edge of the antique vanity, her large knuckles turning stark white, desperately trying to keep her heavy body from collapsing into a dead faint. "I need to get you out of this room," Lorenzo stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble. He stepped away from the vanity, his dark eyes scanning the hallway outside the open door. The mansion was in full lockdown, meaning every exit, every hallway, and every staircase was currently swarming with heavily armed men loyal to the Falcone family. But if Lorenzo's suspicions were correct, one of those men was a traitor who had sold Isabella out to the Lucchese syndicate. "Where can we go?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. She instinctively reached up, her chubby fingers desperately trying to cover the blindingly blue stone resting against her collarbone. "They're all out there. Mr. Falcone, if they see me with this, if they know what I'm wearing—" "They won't see it," Lorenzo interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. He unbuttoned his ruined, blood-stained suit jacket and shucked it off his massive shoulders. He stepped toward Clara, wrapping the expensive, tailored fabric around her broad shoulders. The jacket was huge, even on her heavy frame, and he pulled the lapels tight across her chest, effectively concealing the tears of Sicily beneath the dark wool. It smelled intensely of expensive tobacco, cordite, and copper blood. Keep your head down. Do not speak to anyone. If Matteo asks you a question, you ignore him and keep walking, Lorenzo instructed, his dark eyes locking onto her terrified face. You are under my absolute protection, Clara. But you must do exactly as I say. We are going to my private study on the lower level. It's a reinforced bunker. The only biometric lock in the house that requires my fingerprint and retinal scan. Clara gave a small, pathetic nod, her double chin trembling. She clutched the lapels of his jacket tightly together over her ample bosom. Lorenzo led the way out of the mausoleum that was the master suite. The moment they stepped into the cavernous, dimly lit hallway, the oppressive tension of the Mafia stronghold wrapped around Clara's throat. Two men in tailored suits, holding submachine guns, were stationed at the top of the grand marble staircase. They stiffened respectfully as Lorenzo approached, but their eyes inevitably darted toward Clara. She was a bizarre sight, the fat, invisible housekeeper, flushed and terrified, bundled up in the Don's ruined suit jacket, walking steps behind the most dangerous man in Chicago. Clear the lower corridor, Lorenzo barked at the guards, not slowing his rapid pace. I want a 50-foot perimeter around the study. Nobody approaches the door without my explicit authorization. If anyone breaches that perimeter, shoot to kill. Yes, boss, the guards responded in unison, quickly descending the stairs to clear the path. Clara's thick legs felt like lead as she followed Lorenzo down the sweeping staircase. Her rubber-soled shoes squeaked faintly against the polished marble. Every shadow seemed to hold a gunman. Every tick of the antique grandfather clocks sounded like a bomb timer. They reached the ground floor and bypassed the massive, glittering formal dining room, heading toward the rear of the estate where the architecture shifted from ostentatious wealth to cold, utilitarian security. The door to Lorenzo's study was solid steel, painted a dark mahogany to blend in with the walls. Lorenzo pressed his thumb to a concealed scanner and leaned into a retinal reader. A heavy hydraulic hiss echoed in the hallway, and the steel door clicked open. He ushered Clara inside and immediately slammed it shut behind them, throwing a series of heavy deadbolts. The study was soundproofed, windowless, and lined with walls of leather-bound books, security monitors, and a massive mahogany desk. It felt completely cut off from the rest of the world. Clara let out a shaky breath, finally releasing her white-knuckled grip on the suit jacket. It slipped off her shoulders, revealing the massive sapphire once again. Sit, Lorenzo ordered, pointing to a plush leather armchair opposite his desk. Clara practically collapsed into the chair, her heavy hips sinking deep into the expensive leather. What do we do now? She asked, her voice tight with unshed tears. You said there's a list under the stone. How do we read it? Do we break it? If we attempt to pry the sapphire from its setting without the proper tools, we risk shattering the stone and destroying the engraving beneath it, Lorenzo explained, pacing behind his desk like a cooled panther. He ran a large, calloused hand through his damp, dark hair. Isabella was brilliant. She knew the police would catalogue the necklace into an evidence locker if they found it on her body. But by leaving it in our home, claiming the clasp was jammed, she ensured it remained in my possession. She just never anticipated that it would take me 3 years to look at it. Lorenzo stopped pacing and picked up a heavy, encrypted satellite phone from his desk. There is only one man in Chicago who possesses the microscopic ocular equipment necessary to read an engraving of that scale without removing the stone. He operates out of Jewelers Row on Wabash Avenue. He owes my family his life. Clara swallowed hard, the heavy platinum chain digging into the soft flesh of her neck. Can you trust him? I trust nobody, Lorenzo said darkly, dialing a string of numbers. But Giuseppe is a ghost. I will have my men smuggle him into the estate through the old prohibition tunnels beneath the wine cellar. He will examine the stone on your neck. Clara shuddered at the thought of a stranger inspecting her throat, but she knew she had no choice. She was trapped in a deadly game of mafia chess, carrying a target around her neck. 2 agonizing hours passed in the claustrophobic silence of the reinforced bunker. The storm outside continued to rage, though its thunder was completely muffled by the study's thick steel walls. Clara sat perfectly still in the leather armchair, her broad shoulders aching with tension, the tears of Sicily feeling heavier by the minute. Lorenzo sat behind his mahogany desk, meticulously cleaning and reloading his Beretta, his dark, feral eyes constantly flicking toward the bank of security monitors that showed the rain-soaked perimeter of his estate. Finally, a heavy knock echoed against the steel door, followed by a specific rhythmic tapping. Lorenzo stood up instantly, his weapon drawn and pointed at the floor. He checked the biometric monitor before disengaging the deadbolts. The door swung open to reveal a terrified, soaking wet older man carrying a battered leather satchel. It was Giuseppe. He was flanked by 2 of Lorenzo's most trusted, stone-faced soldiers. Giuseppe's thinning grey hair was plastered to his skull, and his wire-rimmed glasses were fogged with humidity. "Leave us," Lorenzo commanded the soldiers. "Resume your posts at the perimeter." The soldiers nodded, and the steel door hissed shut, locking with a definitive thud. Giuseppe practically collapsed against the wall, clutching his chest. "Lorenzo," the old man gasped, his thick Italian accent vibrating with fear. "Your men pulled me out of my shop through the alleyway. They brought me through the damp tunnels. What is this madness? The whole city is talking about the bloodbath in Cicero today." "I am sorry for the rough transport, Giuseppe," Lorenzo said, his voice entirely unapologetic. "But I need your eyes, and I need absolute discretion. What you see in this room never leaves your lips, or I will cut your tongue out myself. Understand?" Giuseppe swallowed hard, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "Yes, Don Falcone. Of course. What do you need?" Lorenzo holstered his weapon and gestured toward Clara. She sat frozen in the armchair, her round face flushed with humiliation and terror. The grey housekeeper uniform strained against her thick waistline, making her look entirely out of place in the high-stakes underworld. But Giuseppe's eyes didn't linger on her size. They immediately locked onto the blinding blue sapphire resting against her pale collarbone. The old jeweler gasped, dropping his satchel onto the floor. "Dio mio," he whispered reverently. "The tears of Sicily. I have not seen this piece since I appraised it for your father-in-law 20 years ago. It is magnificent." "I don't need an appraisal," Lorenzo said coldly. "I need you to look beneath the stone. The clasp is a deadbolt lock. I believe my late wife hid a microscopic engraving against the platinum backing of the setting." Giuseppe's professional curiosity instantly overrode his fear. He scrambled to his satchel, pulling out a high-powered illuminated jeweler's loop, a set of fine tweezers, and a small, specialized penlight. "Signora, I must ask you to remain incredibly still," Giuseppe said softly, approaching Clara. He pulled a small stool close to her armchair and sat down, his face mere inches from her chest. Clara held her breath, her large chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow pants. The old man's breath smelled faintly of espresso and mint. He clicked on the specialized penlight, directing a harsh, concentrated beam of white light directly into the depths of the massive sapphire. He then pressed the loop to his right eye and leaned in, his nose almost brushing Clara's chin. The silence in the room was excruciating. Lorenzo stood over Giuseppe's shoulder, his massive arms crossed over his chest, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles visibly leaped beneath his skin. Clara stared at the ceiling, trying to pretend she was anywhere else, cleaning the baseboards, washing the expensive china, scrubbing the marble floors, anything to escape the suffocating reality of the moment. "The cut of the sapphire is deep," Giuseppe muttered, adjusting the angle of the penlight. "The light refracts. Wait. Let me adjust the focal length." He twisted the dial on his loop, leaning in even closer. Clara felt a bead of sweat roll down the side of her thick neck. "Yes," Giuseppe breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "There is something there. The platinum backing has been chemically etched. It is incredibly fine work. Only a master laser could have done this." "Read it," Lorenzo commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low decibel. "Read the names." Giuseppe squinted through the loop, his hands trembling slightly as he held the penlight steady. "It is a list. Accounts. Dates. The first name Detective James O'Rourke. Beside it, a bank routing number in the Cayman Islands." Lorenzo didn't flinch. He already suspected the lead investigator was bought. "Keep reading, Judge Thomas Gallagher," Giuseppe continued, his voice shaking. $200,000, dated 1 week before the bombing. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She was listening to the secrets that had gotten a beautiful woman blown to pieces. "There are more politicians," Giuseppe said, straining his eye. "An alderman, a union boss, but at the very bottom there is a different category. It says, internal traitors." Lorenzo stepped closer, his massive presence practically suffocating the small jeweler. "Who?" "Read the name, Giuseppe." Giuseppe adjusted the light one final time, staring deep into the etched platinum beneath the glowing blue stone. He let out a sharp, terrified gasp, dropping the penlight into Clara's lap. He scrambled backward on his stool, his face completely drained of blood. "Read the name!" Lorenzo roared, the sudden explosion of volume making Clara shriek and cover her ears. Giuseppe looked up at the Mafia Boss, pure, unadulterated terror swimming in his eyes. "Lorenzo, I cannot. If I say this name, the city will burn." Lorenzo drew his Beretta in a flash of terrifying speed, pressing the suppressor directly against Giuseppe's forehead. "If you do not say the name, you will not live to see it burn." "Who sold my wife to the Lucchese family?" The old man squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners. "It says, Matteo, your underboss. Matteo took $500,000 to plant the bomb under her car." The name hung in the chilled air of the bunker like a cloud of toxic gas. Matteo. Lorenzo's Beretta slipped slightly in his grip, the barrel dipping towards the floor as the catastrophic weight of the betrayal fractured his reality. Matteo wasn't just an underboss. He was Lorenzo's right hand, the man who had stood beside him at the altar of the Holy Name Cathedral when he married Isabella. For 3 years, Lorenzo had allowed the man who planted the bomb beneath his wife's car to pour his whiskey, guard his home, and coordinate his revenge against the Lucchese family. "Matteo," Lorenzo repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. The feral rage that usually consumed him was replaced by a terrifying, glacial calm. Isabella hadn't been fleeing to the authorities. She had been compiling a dossier of the rot inside her own family, preparing to hand the evidence to her husband. And Matteo had silenced her before she could. Before Lorenzo could process his next move, the heavy intercom on his mahogany desk crackled to life. "Boss," Matteo's voice filtered through the speaker, distorted and metallic. The faux respect was entirely gone. I found the breached tunnel grate in the wine cellar. The perimeter guards saw you pull the old jeweler from Wabash Avenue into the bunker. You know, for a smart man, you make a lot of noise when you're supposed to be in lockdown. Lorenzo didn't press the intercom button. He looked at Giuseppe, who was curled into a trembling ball against the bookshelves, and then at Clara. She was pale, her round face shining with cold sweat, the tears of Sicily rising and falling erratically with her panicked breathing. "Open the door, Lorenzo," Matteo commanded over the speaker, the sound of a heavy tactical rifle racking around, echoing through the audio feed. Isabella was a liability. She was digging into offshore accounts at the Caledonian Bank, trying to play accountant. She was going to burn our alliance with the politicians at the Dirksen Federal Courthouse. I did what I had to do to protect our empire. Now open the door. Give me the jeweler and the fat maid, and we can go back to running this city. Lorenzo's dark eyes locked onto Clara. She squeezed her eyes shut, a tear rolling down her plump cheek, waiting for him to trade her life for his empire. She was just the housekeeper, a heavy, invisible woman who cleaned up their messes. But Lorenzo walked over to the desk, his massive frame radiating lethal intent. He pressed the intercom. "You forgot one thing, Matteo. It's not our empire. It's mine." He slammed his fist down on the security console, instantly cutting the power to the bunker's electronic deadbolts, knowing Matteo would try to override them from the outside. He grabbed the heavy mahogany desk and, with a violent surge of raw strength, flipped it completely onto its side, creating a thick wooden barricade. "Get behind the desk, Clara!" Lorenzo roared, pulling his secondary weapon, a compact Glock, from an ankle holster. "Keep your head down and do not move." Clara didn't hesitate. Adrenaline flooded her system. She threw her heavy body forward, scrambling across the plush carpet and tucking her knees to her chest behind the overturned mahogany. She covered her ears, her entire body trembling violently. 3 seconds later, the steel door of the bunker blew inward with a deafening, concussive explosion. Thick grey smoke and splintered wood filled the room. Matteo and 2 corrupt soldiers stormed through the breached doorway, their submachine guns tearing the room apart. Leather-bound books shredded into confetti. The computer monitors exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. Lorenzo popped up from behind the barricade, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated murder. He fired the Beretta with terrifying, calculated precision. 2 suppressed pft sounds barely registered over the chaos, but the 2 soldiers dropped instantly to the floor, their blood spraying across the imported rugs. Matteo dove behind a leather sofa, returning fire. The heavy caliber bullets chewed through the edge of the mahogany desk, showering Clara with splinters. She screamed, burying her face in her arms, feeling the cold sapphire press painfully into her collarbone. "You're a dead man, Lorenzo," Matteo shouted over the gunfire. "The Luccheses are moving on the estate right now. It's over." Matteo stood up to fire a final volley, but his weapon jammed with a harsh metallic click. He cursed, reaching for his sidearm. Lorenzo aimed, but the smoke obscured his vision, and his shot grazed Matteo's shoulder. Matteo lunged across the room, tackling Lorenzo to the ground. The 2 massive men crashed into the bookshelves, locked in a brutal, bloody struggle for survival. Matteo's hands clawed at Lorenzo's throat, pressing his thumb violently into Lorenzo's windpipe. Lorenzo gagged, his vision swimming with black spots as he fought to dislodge the traitor. Behind the desk, Clara opened her eyes. She saw the man who had protected her moments ago being strangled to death. Survival instinct, mixed with a sudden, fierce loyalty, ignited inside her. She wasn't a trained killer. She was a housekeeper, who carried 260 pounds of weight and moved heavy oak furniture every single day. Clara let out a raw, guttural scream and pushed herself up. She charged across the room like a runaway freight train. Lowering her broad shoulder, she threw her entire massive body weight directly into the towering, heavy brass statue of a rearing horse that stood beside the bookshelf. The 300-pound solid brass statue tipped forward with a sickening crunch, crashing directly onto Matteo's back. The underboss let out a breathless shriek, his spine snapping under the immense weight. His grip on Lorenzo's throat vanished instantly as he collapsed, pinned and paralyzed beneath the brass horse. Clara stumbled backward, gasping for air, her thick chest heaving. She stared in horror at what she had just done. Lorenzo rolled over, coughing violently as he rubbed his bruised throat. He looked at the paralyzed, bleeding Matteo, then slowly raised his beretta. He didn't say a word. He just pulled the trigger once, putting a bullet directly through the traitor's forehead. The room fell into a deathly, ringing silence. The smoke slowly began to clear through the blown-out doorway. Lorenzo slowly got to his feet. He was covered in blood, sweat, and plaster dust. He looked around the ruined bunker, his eyes bypassing the carnage and locking entirely onto Clara. She was pressed against the far wall, weeping openly, the tears of Sicily covered in a fine layer of grey dust. He walked over to her, his heavy boots crunching on broken glass. Clara braced herself, unsure if she was about to be punished for intervening. Instead, Lorenzo reached out, his blood-stained, calloused hand gently cupping her round, flushed cheek. His thumb wiped away a streak of dirt and tears. For the first time in 3 years, the dead, hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by an intense, burning reverence. "You saved my life," Lorenzo whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I just pushed the statue," Clara sobbed, leaning slightly into his warm palm, terrified by how safe she felt with a murderer. "You brought me the truth, Clara," he said softly, his fingers brushing against the platinum chain at her neck. "You wear the crown of my family now, and you will never, ever be invisible again." He turned to the trembling jeweler hiding in the corner. "Giuseppe, unlock the necklace. Then you will walk out of here alive." As the old man scrambled forward with his tools, Lorenzo kept his dark eyes fixed on Clara, his hand resting protectively over hers. Outside, the sirens began to wail, signaling the start of a new mafia war. But inside the ruined bunker, a new, unstoppable alliance was forged, one between the ruthless King of Chicago and the courageous woman who now held his heart. What an absolutely breathtaking, blood-soaked finale. From an invisible housekeeper to the most powerful and protected woman in the Chicago underworld, Clara's terrifying mistake turned into a story of incredible survival and unexpected romance. Who could have predicted that the tears of Sicily held the explosive secret to a mafia war, or that Clara's strength would save the ruthless Don Falcone? If you were on the edge of your seat during this intense, true-to-life mafia drama, we need your support. Make sure to like this video, share it with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heart-pounding stories.